All right, let's dive right in. We're going to unpack the story of a local American crime that somehow set the entire world on fire. We're talking about two pretty obscure Italian anarchists tried for robbery and murder in Massachusetts who ended up becoming the focus of one of the biggest international protest movements of the 20th century. And our story starts not in Boston, but thousands of miles away on the coast of Mexico. Picture this, it's May Day, 1927. About 1,000 workers are gathered at the American consulate. You've got local union officials, one after another, climbing onto this tin garbage can to yell these fiery speeches against American imperialism and Wall Street. So there's this American official just watching the whole scene, and he notices something absolutely fascinating. The thing that gets the crowd really going, the loudest cheers, the most passion, it wasn't for local issues. Nope, it was for two men on death row thousands of miles away in the United States, Nicolas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. To these workers in Mexico, they weren't just names, they were compatriots, they were brothers. And that right there is the big mystery we're going to solve today. From Paris to Buenos Aires, Sydney to London, literally millions of people were obsessed with this case. So why? What was it that turned this American legal drama into a genuine global passion? Okay, first things first. Let's quickly lay out the basic facts of the case that lit the match. Because this wasn't just any trial. It was a 7-year ordeal that grabbed the world's attention and just wouldn't let go. So, on the surface, the timeline seems pretty straightforward. You've got a violent payroll robbery in 1920, two Italian radicals, Sacco and Vanzetti, get arrested. A year later, a jury finds them guilty. But then came a 6-year-long battle of appeals that finally ended with their execution. And trust me, behind this simple timeline, a huge storm of controversy was raging. Right from the very beginning, their supporters were crying foul, calling the whole thing a travesty of justice. And you can see why. The prosecution's case was, well, incredibly weak. They never found the stolen money. There was basically no physical evidence tying Vanzetti to the crime, and both men had dozens of alibi witnesses. But what really stood out was how much the trial seemed to focus on their anarchist politics and their immigrant status. The judge himself seemed to be framing it as a battle of ideologies, not a battle of evidence. So the big question is, how did news of this, let's face it, flawed trial travel so far, so fast? Well, the first piece of the puzzle is that there were these powerful global networks already in place long before Sacco and Vanzetti were even arrested. At the heart of this global movement was this really powerful idea: proletarian internationalism. This was the belief that workers everywhere, didn't matter what country you were from, were all part of one big single global family. The motto was simple: an injury to one is an injury to all. And that belief created this ready-made network for protest that stretched all across the globe. Now, here's what's so interesting. You had all these rival groups that disagreed on pretty much everything, and yet they all jumped on this single cause. First, you had the anarchists, the men's own comrades. Then, the newly formed Communist International in Moscow saw a huge opportunity and called for a worldwide campaign. And by the mid-20s, even the more moderate socialists were all in. They were a totally fractured front, but on this one thing, they were completely united. But this whole thing was about more than just politics. The next piece of our puzzle is all about identity. The case hit such a nerve around the world because Sacco and Vanzetti weren't just radicals, they were Italian. Just look at this number. It gives you a sense of the sheer scale of the Italian diaspora. By 1927, there were nearly 1 million Italian immigrants in France alone, with millions more scattered across Argentina, Brazil, and of course, the United States. So for these communities, this case wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. And this is where things get really bizarre. You had Italy's most famous anarchist, Errico Malatesta, and Italy's fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, basically saying the exact same thing. From two completely different universes, both of them argued that these men were on trial simply because they were Italian. It created this incredibly strange, unlikely united front. And that sense of shared identity just kept expanding. In places like France and Argentina, people started framing the issue as not just Italian, but as Latin versus the Yankee persecutors. One French supporter wrote that the men's revolt was born out of a sentimental Latinism, a kind of shared cultural identity, standing up against what they saw as this cold, mechanical American monster. So pretty soon, the case grew way beyond just workers and Italians. For a lot of people around the world, this became a trial of America itself. The defendants might have been Sacco and Vanzetti, but the country really in the dock was the United States. International observers very quickly started calling it the American Dreyfus Affair. Now, this was a really powerful comparison to a famous French scandal from the late 19th century, where a Jewish army officer was wrongly convicted of treason. It was basically shorthand for saying, here we go again, another great state-sponsored injustice fueled by prejudice. And you have to understand the context here. After World War I, the United States had basically replaced Great Britain as the world's major economic power. And with that new dominance came a ton of international scrutiny. All of America's claims about bringing freedom and democracy to the world were now under a microscope. An injustice in Massachusetts wasn't a local affair anymore. It was a global headline. And those headlines could now zip around the globe faster than ever. A revolution in communications meant that working-class people everywhere could follow the twists and turns of the case almost in real time, reading all about it in their own radical newspapers. From Argentina to Germany, they developed this intimate, daily connection to the drama unfolding in Boston. So, how did American officials react to this massive wave of global criticism? Not well. This quote from Senator Borah, a very powerful guy, pretty much sums up the mood. They saw it as an impudent challenge. So ironically, all this international pressure didn't lead them to rethink things. It just caused many American officials to harden their stance and dig their heels in even deeper. So what's the big takeaway from all this? The final verdict we're looking at isn't really about their guilt or innocence. That's still debated to this day. It's about the case's undeniable historical significance. What was it that made this thing a truly global phenomenon? It really was a perfect storm. You had these radical networks already in place, ready to mobilize. You had a powerful appeal to a transnational identity, both Italian and that broader Latin idea. You had the whole geopolitical backdrop of rising American power, which put its justice system under a microscope. And finally, you had the new tech of mass communications to tie it all together and blast the story to every corner of the globe. When the executions happened on August 23, 1927, Sacco and Vanzetti were instantly turned into martyrs, and the world just erupted. In Paris, you had demonstrators battling police in the streets. In Sydney, 10,000 protesters brought the city to a halt. In Mexico City, a general strike basically paralyzed the capital. This wasn't just a protest, it was a global explosion of pure outrage. And that's really the question that sticks with you, long after the protests faded. The story of Sacco and Vanzetti became so much more than a legal case. It became a powerful myth, a symbol that echoed for decades in films, books, and songs. And it kind of forces us to ask, what's that magic ingredient that turns a historical event into an enduring legend? And why, even a century later, do we still remember Sacco and Vanzetti?